I possibly can, but I know he's going to give us a really stirring and provocative speech that's going to really get us moving for the next session. Thank you, Asif.
Just been promoted. I'm actually Deputy Chief Executive. Well, thanks, John.
But you see, the power of NAVCA can give you a promotion.
Brilliant. I'll sign up. Where do I sign? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me. As John said, my name's Asif. I was part of this inquiry into the future of civil society. And it was really good, actually, John. You were just talking about the future. You know, let's think about tomorrow. And that's really what the inquiry was all about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the inquiry did and what we learnt. But first, if you'll permit me, I was just going to ask you to have a quick chat with the person next to you, if that's okay. I always do this. What I was wondering, could you think about, because I mean, I know, Jane, you were talking about NAVCA and the power that NAVCA has in its network. What I would like you to do with somebody next to you, find a friend, is talk about who currently holds the power in civil society. Who do you think currently holds the power in civil society? And by civil society, we're talking about the voluntary sector, but much wider, you know, anything that's not really in the state or for profit. So it might be like a little WhatsApp group right through to big charities. Okay, so who currently holds the power in civil society? Just have a quick chat, a couple of minutes, and then I'll bring us back together. Thanks so much for that. I know we could talk about this for ages. Just a quick question, a couple of people. What did power mean for you when you were talking about power? What sort of stuff were you talking about? Money? Anything else? The people. Okay, cool. Innovations, power and innovation.
Influence.
Energy. Okay. Influence. Influence where?
Over the policies.
Over policies. Cool. One more?
Who you know.
Who you know, like networks, that sort of thing. Agency. Great, okay. So the ability to act, there's power in that as well. Thank you. The reason I asked that, I suppose, is that actually these are the sorts of questions we looked at in the inquiry. And we looked at it through a particular lens. What we were thinking of was, what does the future of civil society in England look like? If we're going to create a sustainable future for civil society in England, how could we do that? You know, what are the challenges within civil society? And one of the parts of that is, where is the power? You know, how are we arranged? What are relationships like? So that was a big focus for us. And to do this, what we wanted to do was to look forward over the next 10 years, rather than sort of just the next couple of years. And I think I was listening to Julia Unwin, the chair of the panel, talk the other day, and she talked about this Bill Gates quote, where basically Bill Gates said something along the lines of, we always tend to overestimate the impact of change in the next 2 years, but underestimate the impact of change in the next 10 years. So we were thinking quite long term, really, around what the future of civil society is going to look like. So how did we do this? We did the sorts of things an inquiry does. You know, we called for evidence. So we had about 67 formal responses from lots of parts of civil society, academics, a couple of sort of public sector people as well, talking to us about, well, what they think the future of civil society is. We had a number of conversations that community groups organised as well. Seeing some nodding, maybe some people did that here. Great, yeah. So 57 of them. I mean, overall, we spoke to more than 3,000 people across England. We did some, what we call sort of deep dives, but we went to some parts of England and worked in a lot of detail with local people in that area to find out what was going on, what sort of challenges civil society was facing, what they felt needs to change, how they could have a more sustainable future. And the great thing was, people really wanted to talk about this stuff. You know, that was really positive. As you can probably imagine, a lot of what we found was quite challenging stuff. I mean, John's already given a really good praise, I think, of some of the things that were coming out, you know, sort of feeling that our democracy is under threat, our demography is changing, you know, sort of tensions associated with changes in population in local areas, changes associated with digital sort of technology, automation, the impact on work, you know, where people find meaning in life. You know, our environment is changing very fast. Our economy's future, as John was saying, you know, is in question. So these were the sorts of things that were coming out. And many we spoke to, I think, felt that civil society has a really important role to play in addressing some of those challenges in society, but also felt that if we're going to do that, there are some things that we need to address, if you like, some things we may need to tend to, if you like, if we're going to be more effective and sustainable. So that's kind of where we were coming from, I suppose, when we were speaking to people. And in our first year, the 4 main things that we found. And this, I mean, I would say this, you know, I'm kind of part of the inquiry. I feel like we really got out there and talked to people, you know, but I mean, there is something, I think, in the realities of working with some of the local people that we did. It brought to life some of these challenges that people were facing. And types of things we found were, we heard that people really care about place, where they live. Having places where people can meet is really important. And the panel itself, the inquiry, made a commitment to only meet, you know, in civil society spaces. But what that did was gave us quite a good insight into some of the challenges that these spaces face, you know, how little investment there are in some of these places, you know, the sort of disrepair. So there was this issue, I think, about place that came across as really important. We heard that people see civil society as a really important way to express their identity, but that sometimes the way in which that is done in civil society can be quite limiting. So, for example, people are sometimes asked to sort of speak only from one aspect of their identity, like their ethnicity, for example. And, you know, our ability to sort of understand the complexity of identity, you know, how that might intersect with gender, with sexual orientation, that sort of stuff, that wasn't really that was a challenge that people felt was there. As I said, we heard that work is changing, and where people find meaning in their lives, you know, is also likely to change as a result. You know, for many people, work has been a source of meaning, belonging for a long time. And what, you know, sort of as the future becomes about robots, you know, kind of where are we going to find that meaning? What role can civil society play in all of that? And also the way we organise isn't always right as well for what we want to achieve in civil society. You know, the flexibility of the legal structures. You know, we talked to lots of people who were talking about organising in much looser ways, you know, with different types of networks. So that felt that something needed to change there as well. Okay, so that was the first year. The other thing we found, which was really big actually, was that even though lots of stuff had happened in society around that relates to race equality, so for example, you know, sort of post-referendum, spike in hate crime, Grenfell, Windrush, you know, there were lots of things happening in the media, but very few people we were talking to as part of this inquiry into civil society were talking about race. We're talking about race inequality, racism, discrimination. So we felt like we needed to do a bit more digging around that as well, and we took a specific focus on that. So that's the first year. Fast forward to where we are now. You know, we've just launched the report, and this is what the report looks like, by the way. It's quite flashy, it's quite nice. But basically, what we found was that I think one of the biggest findings, and you won't be surprised to hear this, is that civil society really matters. You know, that there's a lot of expectation around what civil society can achieve, needs to achieve. And a sense that kind of the market sort of comes and goes, you know, the role that the state plays in our lives is likely to change over the next 10 years. But one thing that has remained consistent is the role of civil society in, you know, sort of nurturing our democracy, creating a space in which, you know, we can talk about challenging issues and challenge the powers that be, you know, the influence that you were talking about. And also, you know, sort of expectation that civil society can help us to stitch up some of this fragmentation, you know, between, you know, around issues of wealth, age, race, you know. a role, people saw a role for civil society, and also around, things like climate change, a feeling that civil society is one of the best places in which we can actually make an impact on some of these issues. So there was a real sense that civil society has a lot of work to do, and that it's in a prime position to do some of that. But then the other thing that really came across was that as the world changes, in the ways that we've described here, so must we. John was talking about the need for us to think about how we change. And I would say, without a doubt, the most controversial part of the findings from this inquiry has been that we've focused on the need for civil society to change rather than government, rather than business. There's been a very strong focus on that for us. And we'd agree with lots of the criticisms. Yes, civil society does need investment to be heard. Yes, we do need a better relationship. But our argument in this report really is we could have greater impact. For us to have greater impact, if you like, we need to think about how we behave and our attitudes. That's the kind of biggest finding, I suppose, from this. And it's so important because civil society often is sort of the canary in the mine, if you like, for society. It tends to be civil society that knows about stuff before it kicks off, sort of before there is tragedy. I'm just thinking about things like, like the Grenfell Residents Committee that knew about some of what, was likely to happen way before, the tragedy that happened. But to be renewed, to be more effective, there are some changes in attitudes and behaviours. So that's what most of this report talks about. And I'd really encourage you to read it if you get the chance, or to have a chat with somebody about it. You might remember in the 90s there was something called the Deakin Review that came up with this thing called the Voluntary Sector Compact. And basically what that focused on was the relationship between civil society and government. And it talked about things like John was talking about, like, how do we have more equitable relationships in contracts? How does government consult with us better, give us time to respond to these policies that you're putting out? We came up with something that was very much focused on civil society, and we called it the Pact. And much of what's in there, I think, is already present in civil society, but what we're arguing is that some of those behaviours and attitudes need to be nurtured more and thought about more purposefully. So just to end, the types of things that are in the Pact, P stands for power. So it talks about things like shifting power, but also using it more effectively. So I was thinking, somebody, I can't remember, I think it was John, was talking about how some of infrastructure organisations at a local area represent local people, represent local communities. So there's something, one way we might think about power there is, how do we represent, what does representation look like? Who holds the power? How am I using my power to represent at a local level? These are sometimes some quite difficult questions to ask ourselves, but we think if we don't ask them, we're not going to be as sustainable as we should be. The A stands for accountability. Often we're accountable to funders, to government, but our accountability should be first and foremost to those that we work with and those that we serve. And there's something about how we turn that focus a little bit to think about more shared accountability. The C stands for connection. How do we create spaces? I talked about community spaces, civil society spaces. How do we create spaces that are more connected, more open for lots of people from different communities? How do we connect with each other better? And it sounds like the work of NAVCA will be central to some of this in England. How you've already got these really strong connections at a local level across the country. How could we capitalise that? And finally, T stands for trust, which really recognises that there has been a lack of trust in charities, a lack of trust in civil society of late. But also, trust is probably one of our most important currencies in civil society. It's one of the reasons that we can get people to talk to and the local authority can't, for example. You know, there's something about us nurturing that trust, but recognising that we might need to act a bit differently or think a bit differently sometimes to gain that trust. And this isn't optional. You know, I think for us, we came to the conclusion that if we're to remain relevant, if we're to have the biggest impact we can in the next 10 years, then we need to think about these issues like power differently. I hope you'll enjoy the report and that you'll engage with some of these issues impacting your own organisations. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.